Hello and welcome again. My name's Jo Gakonga and today we're going to be talking about different approaches to language presentation. Remember that if you like this video and find it helpful, there are lots of others on the site elttraining.com, and there's also a Grammar for Language Teachers course there if you need a bit of help with brushing up your grammar. If we think about teaching language, the three ways we're going to look at today are PPP, TTT and TBL. So we've got lots of acronyms here which we'll clarify as we go along, I think. If you have a think before we start, these I think are sort of possible components of a language lesson. There may be other things as well, but I think these are the kind of main points that tend to come up in different language lessons. And what we'll see as we go along is that really different methods tend to just put these things in different orders, or to prioritise these differently, I suppose. So have a look at those to start with and put them in your mind so that we can think about them later on. So let's start with one example of a possible method. Have a look at this picture. Who's this man? Where's he from, do you think, perhaps? Is he married? Does he have children? Does he work now? What do you think? And what do you think he did when he was younger? So I'd like the learners would look at this picture and try to answer these questions. When they've done that and we've had a bit of feedback, I'll then tell them that actually he's retired now, but he used to be in the circus. Clearly going to have to make sure they know what circus means. That he was a juggler, and he used to go from place to place dressed like a clown. Everybody used to love him, but now obviously he's old and he's retired. So you've given learners this situation, you've given them a context for this language. So now we look at the target language. He used to go from place to place. This is clearly something that happened many times in the past. It doesn't happen now. So the sort of concept check questions you might ask for this are, did he go many times from place to place? Yes. Does he do it now? No. And you can draw this timeline to clarify for them. The other thing we've got in there is he used to be in the circus. Now, is this something that happened many times? No. Is it a longer action? Yes. Is it true now? No. So he used to be in the circus. It's a longer action that happened in the past. It's not true now. So we use used to for habits and longer actions in the past that don't happen now. You could also ask, is this a long time ago? Well, in this case it is, and we often use used to for things that were quite a long time ago, but it doesn't have to be. I could say, for example, I used to smoke. When did you give up? Yesterday. So it doesn't have to be a long time ago. So if we look at the form here, we've got used plus to plus the bare infinitive. In fact, the way we split this up usually is we think about used to as a semi-modal, in the same way that have to, ought to, want to, going to are semi-modals, followed by the bare infinitive. Of course, this is, slightly semantic. You could say it's used plus the full infinitive, I suppose, but usually we look at used to as a block. The pronunciation here is used to be, used to be. So we drill that with learners, of course. We've got that final D there. We don't hear because of the subsequent T. So the D is a voice sound, the T is an unvoiced sound, but they have the same, you do the same thing with your mouth. So consequently that D gets lost. So used to be. If you don't believe me, try saying the word USETO and and with a D, and you'll find that it says the same thing. You can't tell the difference in the pronunciation. That D does disappear. And the to is weak. It doesn't say to, it says to. So we got used to be, used to be. So clearly you can drill that with learners. So what's the negative then? Used to be in the circus. He never used to do something. So for example, he never used to be late. Is he late now? Yes. Is he late more than once now? Yes. Was he late in the past? No. So he never used to be late is the negative. Learners might want to say this: he didn't used to be late. Now that's possible. Didn't used to be in the circus, for example. That is possible. You see I've got a D on the end of that used. Now Swan says that that's possible there or not, so I'm happy to accept that. Grammatically, of course, it shouldn't be there because we've got didn't, so we need the bare infinitive of the verb used, or use. But because it's a semi-modal in that way, it's slightly odd. But I think the main thing is that we just don't say that. We might say he wasn't in the circus, but we don't use it in the negative like that. Really rarely. We certainly don't write it very often. So I think that's why there's a sort of question mark over what's the form there, what's the spelling there, because it's just not commonly used. We would say he wasn't in the circus, or he never used to be. How about the question form then? How do we make a question with this? Well, again, we can do it the same way. Did he used to be in the circus? And again, that D is potentially there or not. But again, I would say we don't say this. What we say is, was he in the circus? Or was he ever? Has he ever been? Something of that nature. We don't really usually use these as questions. So let's have a little bit of control practice for the learners. Give them a gap fill like this. You ask them to fill in what happened in the past that doesn't happen now. So they in pairs have a look. He used to live in a caravan. He used to have a dog. He used to be married. He never used to be unhappy. Is he unhappy now? Yes. Okay. So you can do a bit of control practice like this, and then tell your partner what your life used to be like. So get the learners to reflect back on their childhood, perhaps, their life before they came to England or Australia or Canada, or if they've moved, their life before they started learning English, perhaps, how life was different. So get them to do some free practice here of that language. This is PPP, which stands for presentation, practice and production. Generally the presentation clearly is where you're clarifying the language for the learners. The practice usually refers to controlled practice, gap fills, drills, that sort of thing. And then production is the freer practice, the more authentic use, if you like. So if we go back to our possible components of a language lesson, we start off by activating schemata. If you're not sure what that means, it's a rather fancy term which basically means just making sure they know what you're talking about. So in the case of the lesson we've just gone through, the picture of the old man would be the activating schemata bit. So the next thing we've got here then is a context for the language. Now that's the situation that I gave you, that he used to be in the circus and he used to go from place to place. So when you're teaching language, you don't want it to be sentences in isolation. It's much easier to understand something and see how it works if it's in a context. So that's really important always, whatever you're teaching, however you're teaching it. So the next stage in this particular way is to clarify the meaning, form and pronunciation, which we looked at. Then we'll have some control practice. That was the gap fill that we did. The teacher would monitor during the control practice, and that's the main stage at which correction would take place. And then we've got free or authentic practice at the end. The learners talking about their own lives, personalising it. Clearly that's important too. It's much easier to talk about yourself than anybody else. In this particular kind of lesson, we haven't got a reading, a listening text or rehearsal. Of course, the context for language could be a reading or a listening text. That might be the context in which from which you draw the language. So PPP is really all about language input followed by output. That's the sort of the model there. A good question, I think, are all P's equal? And the answer is no. So if we've got the presentation stage taking that much time, then the control practice stage should be significantly more, and the production stage should be by far the largest part of the lesson. And the reason for this is that it's not that hard to get it into your brain and to do the control practice. People can do this fairly quickly. And I'm sure you've had the experience of teaching something and the learners were able to do the gap fill really easily and they got it all right, and you think, hooray, hooray, they know it. And then you get to the stage where they've actually got to produce it in real time. They've got to listen to other people and respond in real time, and this is difficult and they can't do it without making many mistakes. And this is why that bit needs a lot of time. If you want another illustration of how important this is, think about any other practical skill. I can teach you, I can tell you how to stand on your hands very quickly, and you can understand what to do very quickly, but it's going to take you an awful lot of that freer practice to get to this stage. Swimming, the same. You know what you're supposed to do. You know what your arms are supposed to do, you know what your legs are supposed to do. It's not cognitively difficult, but the practice, the physical practice, or getting the practical skill right is what takes time. Any practical skill is like this, and language is a practical skill. So what's good about PPP? Well, it's pretty straightforward, especially for novice teachers. You've got a particular chunk of language that you're aiming to teach. So you can prepare for that. You can think about your anticipated problems for that. You can make sure you're really clear about the language for that and how it works and what sort of difficulties the learner's going to have. So from that point of view, it's pretty straightforward. I think another thing that's very attractive about PPP is that it feels as if it's a very logical approach. Now we'll talk more about that in a minute, but to think for most people, intuitively that seems to be the best way to learn things. You learn something, you practice it slowly, and then you build up to more authentic practice. So I think that's another kind of allure of it. It's also a very easy format for course books, and of course this is the way in which most course books are written, even more modernly. To some extent, course books almost have to be written this way. They can't be very flexible, they're print. They have to be in one place. So you very often have some kind of context followed by some sort of language presentation, control practice and a freer practice activity. So given all of this, the next question really is, why does PPP have such bad press? Because it definitely does. It's generally seen as rather dated, old-fashioned, not particularly effective perhaps. So why? Well, there are a few reasons. One of the big ones, I think, probably the major thing, is that it delivers language in what Scott Thornbury nicely calls grammar McNuggets, so little chunks of language. And this kind of assumes a really linear view of language learning, that we learn one little chunk and then the next little chunk and the next little chunk, and we build ourselves up a nice solid wall. This sort of leads to the sort of staff room talk you might hear of, oh, we've done the present perfect. Well, just because you've had a lesson in it, or they've had a lesson in it, does not mean they've done it. They won't have learnt it for sure. They may have understood a little bit more about it, but they won't be able to use it, you know, without making mistakes in normal context for a long time. It'll take a lot of practice. So I think this is the main criticism against PPP, is this idea of, you know, we're doing each little chunk and we're crossing it off, and this is not really the way that language is learnt. So actually the process is much more organic. It's much more akin to growing a garden than it is to building a wall. So if you imagine you plant a few seeds here and you trim a bit back there, and something else is growing all by itself over in that corner, and some of these seeds die and you never see them again, and some of them take a while to germinate but they'll come back, and which bit of the garden you choose to cultivate on any one day probably doesn't make that much difference in the long run, although probably having some overview of the garden is a good idea. So I think that this is a better model really than the wall. The other problem with PPP is that there's a really narrow focus. You go in decided that you're going to teach used to, and that's what you're going in to teach. So the fact that we often use the simple past, for example, for past events, past habits as well, isn't, there's no room for that perhaps. And also, because of this very, very narrow focus, sometimes your practice contexts can be quite forced. For example, if you have the present perfect for experience, I've been to China, I've eaten snake, I've ridden a camel, it's quite difficult to think of a natural context in which that's expressed in a generative way, in which you get plenty of examples of that, except by asking people many questions about their past experience. Have you ever? Have you ever? Whereas the most natural thing to do would be, have you ever been to China? Yes. Oh, when did you go? What did you do there? How long did you stay? So there we've no longer got to focus on that present perfect. So often when you do force language into a particular little hole, it becomes rather inauthentic. It's a fairly predictable format, and therefore possibly boring. That's another possible negative criticism, a criticism that's levelled against it. And I think that often the major focus is on the control practice. What you see a lot is that people get very hung up on the gap fill type of stuff and don't focus on the more authentic use of the language, which is what you really need. So, this is a good question. We've looked at some pretty damning kind of criticisms. Is it really bad? And I think the answer is that it depends on how you do it. That given plenty of focus on the authentic practice, no, it's not bad. And given the fact that you're not spending a lot of time at the board presenting language, you're not giving them gap fill after gap fill after gap fill, then no, it's not bad. And again, it depends a little bit on level. So at lower levels where people genuinely haven't met a particular bit of language before, then that's not a bad way to approach it. But what you often find is at higher levels that learners have met this language before, but they need a bit more focus on it, and they need some correction, and they need practice with it. So it's not really first time use. So I think it isn't as bad as people maybe make out, but it does depend on how it's done, as with many things of course. So let's have a look at a couple of alternatives. this is one, TTT. You've probably heard this as teacher talking time or too much teacher talk, but this stands for test, teach, test. So a way that this can work is that you give the learners a task to do first, some freer practice to start with. So you ask them, what do you usually do on holiday? Give them a little picture to get them thinking about the whole thing, and ask them, what do you usually do on holiday? And they talk together about, you know, I usually go to the beach, or I usually go walking, or sometimes I go to France, or whatever it is. While they're doing this, the teacher goes around monitoring and listening to what the learners are saying and seeing what kind of problems they're having, in this case with adverbs of frequency. The task that you've set them, the thing that you've set them to do, which is talking about what they usually do on their holidays, hopefully is likely to elicit some, usually is never, sometimes. Maybe it doesn't, in which case, you know. So you've got an idea then of how much they actually know and what depth to which you need to present the language. So of course then the next stage is the presentation stage, that you give, you know, maybe a context, a model, your holiday routine, give them something about what you do on holiday perhaps, and focus on the language in just the same way as we did with PPP. But this time it's informed by their previous use. So you've got a much clearer idea of how much they know, how much they're confused, you know, whether you need to go into it in a lot of detail or whether you can skim over quite quickly. This of course could use a discovery approach. This isn't only for TTT, could be for anything, any of these things, but for example you could give them examples of the language. There we go, correct examples. Get them to underline the adverbs of frequency and tell each other in pairs where they can go in the sentence based on the evidence they can see in the examples. So why don't you stop me for a minute and see if you can do it. Okay, as I'm sure you've noticed, usually and often can come at the beginning and the end of the sentence as well as in the middle. Most adverbs of frequency can do this, but always and never can't. And then apart from that, we've got never here before the lexical verb, immediately before the lexical verb, I never swim, and immediately after the verb if it's be, I'm often sad. So those are the main rules. So then of course, a bit of control practice, you could get them to write 5 sentences about their own holidays, maybe using these words. And then finally give them a less controlled task, ask them what do you usually do at weekends. Or you could repeat the same task that you did at the beginning and what you usually do on holiday. The idea being that clearly they've done the task once or something similar, they've seen that they're struggling for certain language, you've taught it to them, you've plugged that gap, and then hopefully they'll be able to do the task again and see themselves that they've made some progress. So if we go back to our possible components of a language lesson, again we've got activating schemata and a context for language. This as usual comes first, but then we've got free or authentic practice immediately, during which time the teacher's going to monitor and find out what they know. Then we're going to clarify meaning, form and pron, followed by some control practice, correction probably at that point mainly, and then more free or authentic practice going right back in the circle, if you like. Again, a listening and a reading text may be part of the context. So there's a question though, is TTT really just PPPP? Is it PPP with another production added at the beginning. And yes, I mean, I guess it is really, but I suppose there's some advantages in it, in that it definitely means there's more time spent in production, in freer practice, because you've added another one at the beginning, and hopefully the presentation will be more focused on the learner's needs, because you'll actually have found out what they are by listening when they do their first P, if you like, or the first T, whichever way you like to think of it. Another alternative, this does still have though all the potential drawbacks of PPP that we talked about earlier. So another alternative to this model is task-based learning. So this has quite a different model at its heart, I suppose, in that the output comes first and the language input comes out of that, as opposed to the other way round. This is Jane and Dave Willis's brainchild, and it's, you know, it's quite well known. An example would be this: you give the learners a task. For example, your class has a choice of holiday: go walking in the mountains, go and lie on the beach in the sunshine. With a partner, prepare to persuade the class to go where you want to go. So you and your partner quickly decide A or B, mountains or beach, and then you have some time together to rehearse and prepare what you want to say, and you're going to tell the class or a smaller group. So this gives you time then to prepare and to think about the language that you want to use. So the learners do the task and they rehearse their language. While they're rehearsing, the teacher monitors, helps. If there's anything the learners want to know, the teacher provides that. You know, they help them to polish their language. So there's a real emphasis here on getting the language right. The learners then present what they've practiced. Now, as I say, this might be to the whole group, or probably more productively, I'd say to do it in a smaller group. So one pair present to 2 or 3 other pairs perhaps, and they take it in turns. Another stage after that, and this is optional but it's often given, is that learners then listen to either native speakers or more fluent speakers doing the same task and notice how it's different. Now, it's as if, or more fluent speakers, if you are a pre-intermediate learner, native speaker talk might be really difficult for you to follow, but an upper intermediate learner might be, 1, easier to follow, and 2, a more realistic model, a more realistic aim perhaps for what you could achieve at this moment. So they're going to listen to the same task and see what sort of language these better speakers use to achieve the same aim. And then the teacher gives input. So at that point you've got language input on the gap between what the language you used and the language which would be more authentic perhaps. After that, perhaps there's further practice, could be controlled, could be freer of the language. So if we go back to this possible components, this is quite different then. We've still got a context for language coming at the beginning, but then we've got the rehearsal, which is an important part of this process, during which time the teacher's going to monitor. Then we've got this free authentic use. Then we're trying to use the language, so you're giving learners a chance to really utilize what they do know and maybe move it forward a little bit. Listening and reading text, and then the clarification by the teacher of meaning form pron of whatever it is that is the gap between what they're using and what they could use more correctly. And then possibly control practice after that, and correction. So what's good about task-based learning? Well, it said that it motivates a real need for new language. So the learners have something to achieve, and so they have got a real need to learn that language. They want it. And if you've got a real need for something, then you're more likely, hopefully, to retain it, I guess. It also deals with learners' emergent language. So it deals with language at the level that they are at, and potentially more as it comes. It's very flexible. So really it's not about the teacher going in with a particular agenda of today we're going to learn XYZ. It's about what do the learners need, and whatever they need can be delivered. What sort of problems come up can be dealt with. And it has a sort of an organic approach to language, so it's not about building the bricks in that wall. It's about looking around the garden, if you like, and seeing what needs tending and seeing what needs nurturing. So in that way there's much more of an organic approach to the thing. I think this sums it up perhaps, that it's really not about the material and delivering the lesson plan. It's about the learners and what do they need. So I think that it's, you know, at its heart it's more learner based, if you like, or at least in theory. There are buts, of course, and I think the big but is that it's potentially very unpredictable. You don't know what difficulties they're going to have, and for this reason it's quite difficult for coursebook writers, and it's very difficult for teachers. Let's deal with both of these things. So coursebook writers, there are some coursebooks that purport to be task-based. Cutting Edge is the sort of most famous example. It has tasks in it, but I don't think it's really task-based, because clearly it's in print. There has to be some idea. There is an idea of what language is to be taught in each chapter. So it doesn't have the real flexibility and the organic approach that TBL perhaps in theory should have. For teachers, of course, it means that you have to have a very wide overview, be able to pick things up very quickly. Your knowledge base has to be very good, because what could come up, you know, isn't predictable. I think especially for novice teachers this can be very difficult, because it's more difficult to prepare for. The other thing I think to think about, is it just test, teach, test by another name? Are you not just giving some sort of freer practice and then teaching afterwards, and then maybe doing some more practice afterwards? I think that the teacher, it's very possible for the teacher to go in with an agenda. So we're doing a task that's about asking for advice, and in my head I've got the idea of should, and I'm going to teach you should. So really it's not so different from PPP or TTT, perhaps because we've got some freer practice to start with. So finally, if you want my tuppence worth, for what it is worth, and maybe it's not worth very much, I think, as with many things in life, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. A fine source of quotes, I feel, Bananarama. And I think, you know, there's no one right way. And I would say, you know, hand on heart, as a teacher with many years experience, I don't particularly use any of these methods per se like that. It's more of a sort of mixture of all those things, with a big prioritization on practice and listening to the learners. And finally, I suppose the other thing to think about is that if it's not fun, and this means for you and for them, then you're probably not doing it right. So I leave you with those thoughts. I hope that's been a little bit helpful, and I'll see you next month. Thank you very much. Bye bye.